If you're a stats nerd, welcome. You're going to have a great time today. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today I am going to take a look back at my reading year in 2021 and I'm going to wrap up how everything went. From my reading to my reading challenges, reading goals, all of that stuff. I'm going to take all of the stats I'm going to work through today from my Cawpile spreadsheet, from my story graph, and from my reading journal. I've been keeping a reading journal for the last maybe 3 or 4 years, and I am genuinely lost without it when it comes to writing reviews for my blog or when it comes to doing up reviews, wrap-ups, or books and brew videos here. There's a lot to get through, so let's get started. First off, one of the most simple stats that we can go through this year. In 2021, I read a grand total of 125 books. Most of these were probably audiobooks, as I got really into listening to audiobooks when working in the first half of the year. In the second half of the year, I kind of went from audiobooks to podcasts every now and then. But I'm really happy with how many books that I had gotten through this year, especially when I had a really big reading slump in the summer of this year and I didn't think that I would hit that many. If Cawpile is completely new to you, then it is a rating system set up by G from Book Roast. I'm going to leave her video explaining it in the description below. There's a whole spreadsheet here where you can take note of everything that you have read in the year, the title, the author, the publication date, what kind of genre it's in. But the main meat and veg of this is the Cawpile system. So you're giving a rating from 1 to 10 under the headings of character, atmosphere, writing, plot, intrigue, logic, and enjoyment. You give each of these a 1 to 10 rating, and the system will calculate how many stars that you are going to give the book. In 2021, I decided to stop giving nonfiction a star rating. I thought it didn't really make sense to go read somebody's life story or read a self-help book and then sit back and say, well, I thought that was worth 3 stars because their life story was actually really, really boring. I didn't think that was fair at all to do. I felt like it really demoralized the things that they have gone through. It didn't really give them the credit that they deserved. So in 2021, I have stopped giving nonfiction a star rating and I will be continuing to do that for the rest of my reading journey. I'm going to put the spreadsheets that I'm talking about here because I have unfortunately absolutely zero idea how to screen record on my new phone. But as I have already said, I read 125 books spread across the 12 months in 2021. The most books that I read in a month was actually a tie between February and March, in which I read 17 books in both months. Unsurprisingly, the lowest books that I read was in September when I only read 4 books. This does make a whole lot of sense when you realise that in September I was packing up my whole life to move across the country, so there was very little time for me to actually sit back and read in any kind of format. I did have a bit of a reading slump from May to September as well, just because I was going through already quite a whole lot outside of the book community and I just needed to focus on that a bit more. So my reading did drop in those months, but thankfully come October, November, December, it was coming back up to where it usually would be. Then we go on to the number of pages that I read in 2021. And according to Cawpile, I have read 40,500 pages, which is a phenomenal amount. This might not be completely correct because for audiobooks and for ebooks, the page count that I went through all came from Goodreads or the story graph, where there could be some fluctuations depending on what edition I had picked up. Maybe the edition that I had found on Goodreads wasn't the one that I was actually listening to or reading on my Kindle, but I tried to be as precise as I could be. The month in which I read the most pages was March, in which I read 5,605 pages. And the month where I read the fewest pages was June with 1,436. June was a kind of a hiccup month, so I'm not particularly surprised by that little bit of a low number. In March, I took part in the Irish Readathon run by Aoife, Elaine and Leanne, and I always love taking part in that, especially since having moved away from Ireland. It brings me back home a little bit, so I was definitely picking up a lot more books in March. I'm not super surprised by that amount. 100% of the books that I read in 2021 were in English, and that isn't really super surprising because I don't generally tend to read books in different languages. However, as I've said in my goals video for 2022, one of my aims for this year is to read a book cover to cover completely in German. So maybe by the end of this year, that pie chart will look slightly different. There might even be a different colour on there. over half of the books that I read this year, I read in audiobook format. I really didn't read a whole lot of audiobooks before maybe the end of 2020. I just kind of got into it a little bit from having listened to A Christmas Carol as an audiobook for the first time. I read A Christmas Carol every single year, so I know the story back to front. I've seen adaptations. I know what happens in it, but I wanted to kind of start off my audiobook with something that I know super well. Didn't really have to sit and concentrate and listen on it, and I think that that was a really good way to start me off. 54% of the books that I read last year, 68 of them in total, were audiobooks. Next highest then was ebooks, with 27% accounting for 34 of the books that I read, and the remaining 17% was 22 physical books that I read this year. Considering in 2021 I wanted to reduce my physical TBR by 30, and that has definitely A, not happened, and B, I have brought more books onto my physical TBR than taken them off. I'm going to say that I absolutely did not smash that goal. Then on to genre, and unsurprisingly, the two biggest categories here are contemporary and romance. The biggest category was contemporary fiction, with 64 books read, accounting for 51% of my reading in 2021. The next highest category was romance, with 28 books read, accounting for 22% of my reading goals. Something that has genuinely surprised me is that I read 11 non-fiction books last year, accounting for almost 9% of my reading, and that was my third biggest category for reading in last year. I have tried to read a lot more non-fiction than I would have previously, so I am really pleased with how that has come out. But I don't think I expected it to be the third highest group of books that I would have read last year. The other genres that I read a lot from last year include crime, thrillers, historical fiction, and actually I read one magical realism book last year, which doesn't really feature quite heavily in the books that I would have read. The length of the books that I read kind of fluctuates, and it turns out that I read a lot of books that hover in the 351 to 400 pages category. I read 39 books of that length, by far the biggest length of books that I have read in 2021. But the next highest would have been around 301 to 350 pages. So turns out that I actually just like books that hover between 300 and 400 pages the most. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of books, we're talking 87 books, so about 67% of the books that I've actually read last year were focused towards adult readers. I have kind of veered away from young adult fiction recently. I think I've just outgrown it. I'm almost 30. I think some of the issues and things that these young adults are focusing on, such as schoolwork, homework, aren't really relevant to my life anymore. So I like to read more about people who are going through the same things that I'm going through. But that doesn't mean that I didn't read any young adult fiction last year. In fact, young adult fiction was the second highest age category that I read from, with 21% of the books that I read last year coming from that age group alone. The majority of books that I read in 2021 were published within the last 3 years. So I read 16 books that had been published in 2019, 24 that had been published in 2020, and 39 that were published in the year 2021. That accounts for about 60% of the books that I had read last year, and I am intending to kind of go through my backlist a little bit, go through books that have been published a little bit further before than that, and try and get through some of those. Something that has actually surprised me about the books that I read in 2021 is that the majority of them were borrowed. 59 books, so 47% of the books that I read in 2021 were borrowed, either from the library or from Scribd, or had borrowed from another friend of mine. I kind of expected NetGalley to have been one of the biggest sources for books that I read in 2021, and it was quite big already, with 26% of the books that I read coming from there. But I kind of thought that that would be the biggest one, because I really tried to concentrate on NetGalley towards the end of the year. Last year, unfortunately, only 28 of the 125 books that I read featured LGBT plus representation. Of those, 6 featured gay characters in them, 5 featured lesbian characters, and 5 featured bisexual characters. It's definitely something that I would like to improve upon in 2022, and I'm glad that I now have this kind of benchmark that I can say, let's try and up that percentage a little bit more. The vast majority of the books that I had read in 2021, I had read them for the first time in that year. But I had 23 rereads in 2021. Some of these were featured in the Jacqueline Wilson-thon that we ran in February, which gave a chance to kind of go back to one of my childhood favourite authors. But also I read through quite a lot of the I Heart series in 2021, and those definitely counted as a reread. I am maybe going to try and reread a little bit less this year because I feel like it's always a good option to go out and explore what else is there rather than going back to the books that you already know and love. That, however, doesn't mean that I'm not going to reread anything this year. Reading in a standalone or series was an almost perfect 70-30 split in 2021. 88 books, so just over 70% of the books that I read in 2021 were standalones, while the remaining 29.6% of the books that I read were all part of a series, whether it was one that I was continuing or one that I had just started for the very first time. I really like series for how invested you can get in a character, for how much you can follow their development and their character growth, but I do still have a really big place in my heart for a standalone, as you can see from this graph. Only 18 books, so about 14% of the books that I read last year were written by an author of colour. Of these, the majority, 50% of them were Black authors. I also read quite a few Southern Asian authors, so 4 books came from them. 2 books were Asian authors, 2 books were Latina authors, and 1 was a Hispanic author. I also read 19 books by an own voices author, whether that was somebody who had written a book about transgender characters who was transgender themselves, or an author of colour writing about characters of colour. I really enjoy hearing people's own stories about their own experiences, their own lives, their own lived experiences, and that is definitely something that I'm going to look more into in 2022. Given how much I love Irish authors, being Irish, being from Ireland, reading about Ireland, I am really surprised how low down the list Irish authors are of the nationality of authors that I read last year. 61 books were written by a British author, 31 books were written by an American author, and 21 books were written by an Irish author. The rest of the books are spread around countries such as the Dominican Republic, Australia, Sweden, and I am definitely going to try and put a couple of more countries on that map for next year. Onto some from the story graph. I feel like the story graph takes a much deeper look at how your reading in the year went. The story graph gives you a much clearer look at what kind of moods you read, how long the books are that you are reading are, how much kind of slow-paced they are. I really enjoy that kind of insight. So let's take a look at some more graphs that come from there. The majority of the books that I would have read last year were light-hearted, which does make a lot of sense because a lot of romance books, a lot of contemporary romance books are all very light-hearted books indeed. But other emotions that I would have felt from my reading are emotional, funny, reflective, hopeful, and some were a little bit dark, and I'm assuming that that comes from the thrillers that I would have read in the year. It seems that I enjoy a medium-paced book rather than any other. 41% of the books that I read in 2021 were of a medium pace. 39% were fast-paced, and it's not really a big surprise to me that only 20% of the books that I read would have been slow-paced. I don't really enjoy reading slow-paced books. I find that it drags so much. It takes such a long time for the action to kick off, for you to get anywhere that you really want to go with the book. So I do kind of tend to swerve away from those more than I would have, say, a faster paced book or a medium paced book where you feel like the action is just keeping going the whole time. Surprisingly, and something that I have never referenced here before, is that the biggest author that I read last year was Cecily Von Siligar. I started reading the Gossip Girl books as an audio book maybe April or May of last year. I haven't gone back to any of them because I don't really enjoy them. I just wanted to get through them to say that I had already read the book series, but I read 7 of those already in 2021. She is then tied with Jacqueline Wilson, from whom I also read 7 books in 2021. Lindsay Kelp was my third highest with 5 books read last year, and Talia Hibbert comes in next with 4 books. So, on to the final thing that we're going to look at, how the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge went. If you want something a little bit more in depth, I have got a video covering every single book that I had read for it, And as I said in that video, I finished the year with 49 of the 50 prompts ticked off. There was only one that I missed out, and that was a book by an Indigenous author. I had a book in mind for that, but unfortunately, every time I went to get it from my library, it was completely booked out. I always keep a track of how my progress goes throughout the year. I take a look on the 1st of April, the 1st of August, and the 1st and 31st of December to see just how far I've gotten and how much more there is to go. On April the 1st, 2021, I had ticked off 23 prompts from the Pop Sugar Challenge. On August the 1st, I had ticked off 35. On December 1st, I was up to 44, and on the 31st of December, I had 49 of the prompts ticked off. I feel like that's really good going. It's the furthest I've ever gone this year, and you can absolutely bet that this year, I want to say that I have finished the challenge. I have about 360 days left to go. Let's keep going. That is a look at how all of my reading went in 2021. Did you have any in common with me there? Did you have any kind of stats that you thought were really interesting? Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.